If you know anything about me or my channel, you know I'm not one to shy away from criticizing mainstream animated films, but I think that there's truth to the idea that if we exclusively focus on the times when movie studios post-cringe, then we might forget about the times that they don't. After all, if we didn't have good animated films, how would we know that there are bad ones in the first place? Yins and Yangs. Well, for our purposes, our yin will be Aardman's Shaun the Sheep movie, and our yang will be Minions, in case it wasn't obvious.
Big Chungus.
Now, let me answer one thing right off the bat. Why am I even talking about Minions, a movie that was deservedly beaten to death 5 years ago? Well, the case of Minions and Shaun the Sheep is an interesting one, to say the least. Not only are there an alarming number of similarities between Minions and Shaun the Sheep that you can't ignore, but the movies came out merely a month apart, so obviously one couldn't have influenced the plot or development of the other. It's kind of phenomenal if you think about it. So to be clear, yes, I'm going to discuss those yellow pill-shaped f***s that we've come to abhor, who first oozed their way into popular culture at the genesis of the Despicable Me franchise. We are going to discuss the Minions movie, which I consider to be the film equivalent of a stomach ulcer. But this video is really about Shaun the Sheep, which has gotten far less press. You probably knew about Minions before watching this video because it is one of the most awful things to screen in theaters. But because Shaun the Sheep was so harmless, many of you may not even have heard of it. And it is much more important to me that you come away with a positive impression of Shaun the Sheep than a negative impression of Minions. So consider this my heartfelt drop in the bucket, compare and contrast exercise where I attempt to lay out why Shaun the Sheep is a work of creative genius in a time of desolation in the animated film industry, and how it prevails as the anti-Minions in almost every respect conceivable. Part 1. X-Minions Origins. Anyway, let's start out with our first key difference. Unlike the Minions, Shaun the Sheep the character has been around for nearly 25 years, and is a creation of Aardman, a British animation studio which at the time was already established and well respected. Yes, Aardman has a pretty decent track record when it comes to movies. Their 3 original Wallace and Gromit shorts, Chicken Run, and The Curse of the Were-Rabbit, are nothing short of fantastic, but after like 2005, their feature filmography started to wane a little bit. I'm not talking Cars 2 levels of bad, but their ideas and execution just weren't as strong as they used to be.
Bomb! Yes, Mater! You are the bomb! That's what I'm trying to say!
I've always thought that when you start losing your appeal, a good place to look is back at your roots. No, this doesn't mean rehashing your own material and retreading the same ground, as tempting as that may be. With this in mind, enters Shaun the Sheep, a character introduced in the 3rd Wallace and Gromit short film, A Close Shave. In short, get it? Shaun is the member of a flock that the title characters are attempting to save from being rustled and turned into dog food. And yes, his name is a play on the British pronunciation of the word shorn, which might be the most British joke you've ever heard. Sometime around 2007, Aardman decided, hey, you remember that obscure character we created that has shown up only once more since 1995? Let's give him a TV show. But the Shaun that we were introduced to in A Close Shave bears only slight resemblance to the Shaun the Sheep in the spin-off series. In A Close Shave, Shaun is timid and clueless, but in the TV series he's clever, friendly, and mischievous, not to mention he's interacting with a completely different cast of characters who don't communicate in any audible form of English. I like to think that this later iteration is a slightly more experienced Sheep who has grown up a little more. Even with all of this, you don't have to have watched anything Shaun related before the movie to get a good experience out of it. Then on the other hand, we have the Minions. I hate to say it, but even the origin of the Minions is similar to Shaun. The Minions were introduced in Illumination's first feature film, Despicable Me, an animated movie starring Steve Carell that came out in 2010. Despicable Me was about a disgraced supervillain who wants to pull off the ultimate stunt, stealing the moon. Part of this involves enlisting the help of 3 orphan girls to break into his arch nemesis's lair. It was pretty funny, and it had heart, if a little formulaic, and yes, it ended with a dance party like literally every other goddamn animated movie, but it was good. Not great, and above average for the time. Now, in my opinion, the Minions were never an integral part of Despicable Me. They were kind of there for sight gags, their funniest jokes being interactions with other characters, and definitely only in small doses. I am not too proud to say that there was a point in time when I did not mind the Minions. In fact, for a brief moment, I may have thought they were funny. But there is no reason why anyone would think a spin-off movie devoted to the Minions would be a good idea. Oh wait, I guess what they learned from that experience is to do it again, as they're making a second Minions movie, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. I mean, Gru is the warmest color. I mean, after Minions came out, they had kind of solidified themselves as a symbol for corporate America. They were in sticker books, they were claw machine prizes, and that was just the licensed stuff. It got so much worse. So much fucking worse. But we don't have to tread down that yellow and blue brick road again. You can just take my word for it. I guess you could say the same thing about Shaun in A Close Shave, that the character of Shaun didn't immediately suggest massive potential. And if every boomer aunt made savage Shaun posts, that'd probably wear thin on me pretty quick too. But we'll talk about how the characters in Shaun the Sheep were developed in a much more intelligent and creative way later on. Oh, I mean right now. Part 2. Believable characters. Now, when you're making a kid's movie, you gotta balance a few things as it relates to creating and developing characters. Just because kids are gonna draw rudimentary conclusions does not mean you should make your characters rudimentary. Characters are what make your movie last long after its release and can carry it further into pop culture than the story and presentation ever could. This is especially the case with animated movies because of how poorly they age. Think about movies like the original Toy Stories and characters like Buzz Lightyear and Woody. As soon as I mention their names, I bet you could instantly visualize them, but that visualizing goes beyond the 3D renders, right? Woody is a cowboy. He's voiced by Tom Hanks. He's a calming presence, he's a leader, but when he's no longer the top dog, he starts to screw up. So even though his animation looks like this, it's fine because there's more to it than colorful, detailed visuals. Thank fucking God. But we'll get into the respective art styles later. When I rewatched Shaun the Sheep, I was pretty impressed with how seamless the character introduction is, and their dynamic with the rest of the cast. We have Shaun, who's curious, mischievous, and a leader. He's at conflict with the farmer and the farmer's dog characters because they boss him around and tell him what to do. Despite rather mild intentions, he has more than once indirectly caused the main conflict, as he does in this movie. Then there are the farmer and the farmer's dog, Bitzer, and here we have an interesting dynamic in itself. The farmer is kind of lazy and a dumbass. He's completely clueless about what the sheep get up to because he's too busy browsing TikToks. But despite this, he truly cares about the flock and is there for them when they need him most. While Bitzer is a subordinate of the farmer, he's usually the one to create and enforce the rules, often following order to a fault. He tends to get distracted by his own animal instincts because he's a dog after all, which creates problems of their own. We have a few other sheep like the lamb Timmy, Timmy's mom, Nuts, and Shirley, as well as other less descriptive characters whom I honestly don't remember the names of. So no, we're not talking about fucking Lord of the Rings here, but it's more than enough to make the movie work for viewers older and younger than the age of 7. Each of the main characters are very carefully considered and developed throughout the movie. It makes you feel like the writers actually knew how to tell a story with a beginning, middle, and end, with the ingredients with which they provided themselves. Shaun and his flock learn that without the farmer, they can't take care of themselves, for example. There's a nice scene about halfway in where the characters are taking shelter in a dumpy back alley. You get an interesting contrast between their barn and their current circumstances. They look up and see there's a painted-on spider web where the real spider would be in their barn. It's a subtle image, but it adds to the visual storytelling. It's not the kind of movie where everyone learns their lesson and changes permanently at the end, necessarily. Shaun is still going to screw around and defy the rules. Bitzer is still going to be an overbearing Gestapo dog. It's more important that the audience is introduced to these themes of consequence, especially since a lot of them are on the younger side, without having it forced down their throats like broccoli and cheese sauce. Then there's the Minions. Probably the number one criticism of the Minions is that they're remarkably unremarkable. Each character looks and behaves almost exactly the same as the next. It's just a bunch of random XD bullshit as they jabber in their annoying faux language about banana or whatever.
Stuart felt hungry mostly. He was going to be the one to eat this banana.
But you probably already knew that. What you didn't know is it gets even worse, and this is a point that I haven't heard anyone make yet. In Minions, there are 3 main Minion characters, Kevin, Stuart, and Bob. Kevin is the leader character. Stuart is the fun-loving character who plays by his own rules. Bob is the innocent baby character. If this sounds familiar to you, it's probably because they are the exact same archetypes as in Despicable Me, with Margot, Edith, and Agnes. Yeah, they pretty much ripped off their own movie. There are also a number of human characters who are about as two-dimensional as it can get. Scarlet Overkill is the main villain of the movie, and she's given next to no motivation. She's also played by Sandra Bullock, who's giving an unnervingly phoned-in performance.
Buckle up, boys. Next stop, England.
It'd be really f***ing great if you acted like you actually gave a shit.
Seriously, it's almost as great as Pyrocynical's performance in Hunt Down the Freeman.
Oh, Colonel, we are so...
To make matters worse, there are a lot of parts of the movie where it feels like they flat out forgot which characters they were writing. If you were watching this movie without context, you might think that Banana is a quirky character trait of Stuart's, but then it becomes a character trait of Bob in the next scene, and it's established that Kevin is the leader early on, but he never demonstrates his leadership ever again. And it's not even because the movie devolves into a brain-dead action sequence in the last half hour and it's impossible to have any substantial character development, which it does. There was even an opportunity like 20 minutes into the movie during the hitchhiking scene. The characters are trying to travel to Villain Con, and they figure out it'll be faster if they hitchhike. Kevin is about to try, and then Stuart pushes him aside to show him how it's done, and instead makes a fool out of himself. Would it not have made more sense if Kevin was the one who took charge? You know, because he's the leader, the guy who's supposed to have a plan for everything? And why is it Bob who becomes King of England towards the end? Would it not have been better to show Kevin what true leadership is or something? I'm not saying it would have fixed the movie, but it's at least something. Why would you introduce these characters? I don't really want to talk anymore about the contents of these movies without discussing how they look. This also happens to be one of the biggest points of difference between the two movies. As I mentioned before, Shaun the Sheep is stop-motion animated, meaning every frame of the movie is a still picture. Stop-motion is almost always a labor of love. The amount of pain and precision that is required to make a single shot look good is nearly unimaginable. All it takes is for you to screw one thing up. You bump the camera, you knock something over, and the whole shot becomes inconsistent and therefore ruined. I'm not attempting to minimize the effort that CGI animators put in, which can be a thankless task of its own, but when you're making a movie where literally every frame counts, you're probably going to think it through a little more when doing it stop motion. And it shows. Every time I see Shaun the Sheep, I almost appreciate it more. I've spoken in the past about how powerful minimalism can be and how less is more, and Burton and Starzak seem to recognize this too. Maybe you'd think that they'd try to pack as much as they can in each scene because of how long it takes them to shoot, but the restraint we're shown is extraordinary. As previously stated, in terms of spoken language, characters will make noises to indicate emotion, but that's about as far as it goes. Even written language is downplayed. If there is actual English shown, it'll be concise and only as specific as it needs to be. This gives you time to take in the beautifully sculpted environments and scenery. Don't get me wrong, complex visuals and a broad scope definitely have their place and can make a scene look more alive than standard stop motion, but sometimes it's nice to see something that is, in the best possible way, quaint. Minions, however, shows how simplicity in presentation when taken to the extreme doesn't necessarily yield positive results. The industry standard for CGI animated films set by Disney, Pixar, DreamWorks, and Sony, among others, is to create extremely high-quality renders that push the budget over $100 million every time. Illumination's Chris Meledandri, however, doesn't seem to care much for that. According to Illumination's Wikipedia page, one way the company sustains a lean financial model is by employing cost-conscious animation techniques that lower the expenses and render times of its computer graphics. What do cost-conscious animation techniques ultimately amount to? Reused models, bland and empty environments, and boring character design, which in the case of Minions is next to non-existent even. So in other words, if these movies age like a piece of moldy cheese in the back of your refrigerator, that's a-okay with these fuckers. I understand that they're trying to make the movie look cartoony or whatever, but god, it just looks so meh. Aside from the shaders and lighting, some scenes from this could be from a high-budget movie from 2007. Am I really supposed to believe that Pixar animators have some magic powers that Illumination animators don't? Or did the executives put a gun to the head of the art directors and tell them they'll be murdered if they attempt anything resembling creativity? We've reached this weird point where 3D animated movies are actually easier to make than 2D animated movies, but since they refuse to allow any detail in Minions' flat, boring renders, the CGI comes across as overkill. Scarlet overkill. Another thing they screwed up is the way information is conveyed. As I said before, Shaun the Sheep is a result of intelligent, disciplined filmmaking. They understand that because there's no dialogue, people are going to be paying attention to visual context clues. Minions has about as much discipline as a spring breaker in Miami.
If I get corona, I get corona. At the end of the day, I'm not going to let it stop me from partying.
Infection.
For the first act of the movie, there are no human characters. There's a voiceover narrator with a funny English accent because what better way to inform your audience than to make it as blatant as possible?
If this continued any longer, the minions would perish.
Minionese is a total sham. It's a distraction to make you think things are happening when it's the complete absence of information. If anything was being accomplished with the dialogue, maybe this movie would have a story. Oh, speaking of which. Part 4. Cool story, babe. Now make me a Shaun witch. The greatest contrast between Shaun the Sheep's and Minions stories is that Shaun the Sheep actually has one. Now, the plot of Shaun the Sheep is pretty straightforward. Shaun is bored of routine and wants to give himself and his flock a day off, so he hatches a plan to put the farmer to sleep so they can relax. Everything is going fine until Bitzer catches them and makes them wake up the farmer. This results in the farmer's trailer rolling all the way into the big city, where he eventually wakes up, only to hit his head and lose his memory. The rest of the movie is about Shaun, Bitzer, and the flock attempting to fix Shaun's mistake and bring the farmer back home, all while evading an animal containment worker who threatens to lock them up. If you've seen classic Aardman movies in the past, then you're probably aware that a common theme is some kind of ridiculously complex contraption that acts as the final means of whatever the villain is trying to accomplish. In A Close Shave, it was the Mutt-No-Matic. In Chicken Run, it was the chicken pie machine. In The Wrong Trousers, well, it turned out to be the right trousers, actually. In this case, the animal containment guy gets an electric taser grabber thing. It's clearly supposed to be over the top, but it's appropriately more subdued than some of the doomsday devices Aardman has wheeled out in the past. As I mentioned before, the story has a wonderful uncomplicatedness that makes watching this movie effortless. Everything that is introduced is familiar and believable, and it's completely to the movie's benefit. You often see criticisms of other similarly classed animated movies saying they all talk about the same themes as other animated movies, except do it worse. Turbo is about overcoming your background to accomplish your dreams, but does it in a far sloppier and less enjoyable manner than Ratatouille. Then again, Ratatouille doesn't have a snail played by Samuel L. Jackson, so that's a point in Turbo's favor.
Now I'm gonna pretend I didn't hear what I clearly just heard.
Heard what?
And while it's true that Shaun the Sheep isn't the type of movie to make you sit back and think about themes like death, responsibility, or finding one's place in the world, does it really fucking need to? Now, I'm coming dangerously close to saying a plot isn't important in this kind of movie, so let's look and see what happens when you don't have any plot at all. In Minions, the story synopsis on IMDb reads, Minions Stuart, Kevin, and Bob are recruited by Scarlet Overkill, a supervillain who, alongside her inventor husband Herb, hatches a plot to take over the world. This synopsis is incredibly misleading because it would lead you to believe that this movie is actually about anything. I guess the best way to describe Minions is that it's not a movie with a logical beginning, middle, and end, but a series of events that trigger changes in color on your television screen for about an hour and a half. As I explain these events, you're going to hear me use phrases like, for some reason, and somehow ends up a lot to explain how these events occur, but don't worry, you won't go insane. I know I didn't. The movie starts off by completely revising the history of the Minions. In a Despicable Me short film, you're led to believe Minions are one of Gru's genetic experiments or something, whereas in the feature film Minions, they've been around since the dawn of time. I checked recently and it turns out that the short film has since been deleted from YouTube, but there are plenty of re-uploads affirming this. Nice try, Illumination. You're not gonna Tiananmen Square massacre your way out of this one. At the start of the movie, the main plot seems to be that the Minions are attempting to find a master, but for some reason they keep screwing it up. It's never really explained what kind of value they have to provide. They're just kind of there and they want to be enslaved. How charming. Desiring to be enslaved by a cruel overlord is kind of a weird concept to introduce to children to begin with, but it wouldn't be so bad if they actually stuck with it. There's a good amount of the movie where the characters don't seem to be interested in having a master at all. In the beginning, the characters end up in some kind of ice cave, and then I guess their incessant need for subservience is put on hold again until the characters collectively decide they need a master after all. So Kevin, who I explained before is supposed to be some kind of leader figure, hatches a plan to find a master. I'll put plan in quotation marks because it's never really explained what the plan is exactly. It turns out their idea of a plan is to go and look for a master. Again. But didn't they already try that for like thousands of years or something? What exactly is supposed to have changed? They hear about a villain convention and on their way they're told about a supervillain named Scarlet Overkill. They decide that she fulfills some unexplained criteria for a master and manage to convince her to take them on as helpers.
Herb, my baby.
You know I am.
Forget that there are only 3 of them at this point, and that it's already been made crystal clear that minions are most effective in large numbers, although I guess we've already decided that consistency isn't important. Then the plot changes again to a kind of heist movie where they're supposed to help Scarlet steal the Queen's crown because they gave her some vague bullshit backstory about how she wants people to respect her. She's like the biggest supervillain in the world. Isn't she already respected? Shaun the Sheep's animal containment worker, on the other hand, is an example of how they could have done this character right. In that case, they don't waste any of your time with a nonsensical backstory. You get one scene with him, and it's immediately clear that he's just a dog catcher who takes his job way too seriously. Again, subtlety, not whatever the this is. Then Bob somehow gets crowned King of England. Scarlet shows up again and puts the Minions in a dungeon because she believes they tried to usurp her command. And the last 30 or 40 minutes of the movie are just them trying to escape Scarlet. Again, there's not much else to say about the plot. Nobody learns anything, there's no message, and there wasn't a point to anything. In a prequel like Minions, you're supposed to answer a question about the origin or backstory of a character that gives you a greater appreciation of the franchise as a whole. Some examples of great movie prequels are... No, not that. Well, only half of that was a prequel. Okay, so there aren't a lot of great prequels out there. In fact, most of the time, it's a mistake because you know where the plot is going to wind up, and nobody really wants to watch a character develop to their starting point in the movie that they've already seen. Prequels have a little more success as TV shows like Better Call Saul, Mandalorian, and Clifford's Puppy Days, but that's usually because there's so much source material to work with in the primary series that a fresh story in the same universe can often be warranted. I just don't get why we're supposed to care about Minions, or why it even exists. Oh yeah, now I remember. Part 5. Watch your f***ing tone with me, young man! What Shaun the Sheep and Minions are attempting to achieve in terms of mood or tone was fundamentally the same thing, except they took wildly different approaches. They're both supposed to be laugh-out-loud adventures for the whole family, and heck, you can often forgive a movie for having a thin plot or even weaker characters if it's just gut-bustingly hilarious. Borat, for instance, doesn't even have a plot. It's just a Kazakhstani journalist bumbling around the US, and it's one of the greatest comedies ever made. The humor is what makes Shaun the Sheep such a delight to watch. Because it's basically a silent film, a lot of the jokes are sight gags, but they're also cleverly done, it doesn't wear on you. Aardman is a British animation studio, so, as you'd expect, a lot of the humor is very British. The concepts are classic ideas, but executed in such a fresh way, it's just a joy to watch at any age. And you know what? To be completely honest, I don't want to get too specific about what jokes I found the funniest, because it's a movie that you just have to see for yourself. Minions also coincidentally takes place in England, and boy, they will not let you forget it. It's an American movie, so it's true that most of their audience isn't going to be familiar with British culture and is going to find it amusing just because it's different. But when that's all you have, it gets grating real fast. Nearly every single joke is something relating to England or the monarchy. English people drink tea, isn't that hilarious? Look, it's the Beatles. Kids think the Beatles are funny, right? Oh, and the Queen is Big T.
오늘 완전 파랗고 미세먼지 제로잖아. 어제 비 왕창 온 덕분에. 그치? 뭐 그 덕에 캠핑 나가리, 가든 파티 콜. 전화위복이지 뭐.
Shaun the Sheep uses England as a spice for original jokes, whereas Minions uses it as a punchline.
Britain be like.
Both films make heavy use of physical and slapstick comedy too. Shaun the Sheep prioritizes showing cause and effect to ground the jokes, but Minions has no such concern. According to Minions, there's a little more to physical comedy than explosions, slapping people, laughing at people after slapping them, and dance numbers. Ugh, just stop it. F***ing stop it already. Why did I make this Conclusion. Oh god, was there even a point? Something as especially cynical and lazy like Minions will show up again every couple years, kind of like it's the clown from It or your estranged uncle asking for booze money. That's the way it's been for a while, and it's probably not going to stop anytime soon. But at least we have Shaun the Sheep for now, which accomplishes all the same things that Minions did, except, you know, better. Shaun the Sheep has interesting characters with motivations and personalities, where Minions has bland, uniform characters that you really don't care about. Literally, they all wear the same uniform. Shaun the Sheep has a wonderful style and presentation that shows how creative you can be with stop motion, whereas Minions barely scratches the surface of a medium that, with the funds that Illumination has at their disposal, has no limitations. Shaun the Sheep has a gentle, charming story, whereas Minions is a digitized migraine. And lastly, Shaun the Sheep is an all-around, much funnier movie. Both the Shaun the Sheep and Minions franchises are releasing or have released sequels this year. I've already seen the Shaun the Sheep sequel and enjoyed it thoroughly, and even though my boy is back in Minions 2, I'm not sure there's any saving Despicable Me from its gruesome demise. But I don't really care. Hopefully you enjoyed this video in the meantime, though, because as I always say, if I could make one person smile or pee their pants a little, my day was not wasted.